Hello, this is video 3 of Pastoral Foundations in Atlantic School of Theology, and I am Reverend Dr. Linda Yates. So I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be an intensive class. The next class is also intensive. It's a lot of theory, and it's just a lot to think about. So, you may need to watch this a couple of times. That your reading should help you a lot. This is designed to complement the reading and to kind of highlight some important things from the readings that you're doing. So I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up here, and as usual, it will be posted on Brightspace, and so you can read along or you can look at it afterwards to review. So one of the things that Cooper White talks about is thick theology. And when I was doing my doctorate at the Lutheran Seminary, they talk a lot there about thick data. So if you think about doing research and trying to find information, if you were to do a questionnaire, if you were to count something in some way, my son examines the DNA sequences in fish. That's one way of gathering data. We normally call that hard data, but there is another way of gathering data that's called thick data, and that is a data that allows you to capture narrative and story, and so it's called thick because there can be so much meaning in it that you can't capture with questionnaires or counting things, etc., etc. Not that those things are bad, we need those, but thick thick data is about the density of the capacity to have expansive language and stories and narratives when you're talking about things. So, thick theological theory is the same. It's a theology that asks a lot of questions. It's a theological questioning that allows other kinds of narrative to come into it. So in thick theology, questions matter, and metaphors are very important. And you don't just stick with one metaphor because you recognize that the truth, especially the truth of God, is that so rich and thick that one metaphor is not enough. For example, one metaphor is God as male, and is not really enough because you can't really describe God with one gender because God is beyond and inclusive of all genders. So, thick theology means that the more you take in information, the more your questions spiral out and into iterative learning. And what iterative learning is remember the learning spiral is that you have a theory, you live it out, you experiment with it, you go into the field, you try it on, and then you reflect on what happened, and then you adjust your theory so it becomes thicker. So it's a process of iterating learning. And so why does theory matter? So it's important to have a methodology when you are caring for and counseling people. If people are asking you to walk with them as they are coming apart, you need to have a framework from which to understand how their lives are put back together. So, you need to have a psychological theory that grounds you. And, you can't go running around doing whatever you think. It's just not fair to the person. It's not fair to you either. So it's important to have theory, and it's important to have well-established theory. So Pamela Cooper White says unarticulated theories for people who are doing counseling or pastoral care can be as harmful to parishioners and patients as rigidly guarded conscious formulations. So, having an unarticulated theory that you're just going to wing it and trust your gut is harmful to patients and to parishioners. So you really need to be grounded in theory. And many of you maybe have theory already. Maybe you're social workers or psychologists, or you've likely done courses. Perhaps you've received therapy. Always a good idea periodically throughout your ministry. And perhaps you've talked to other helping professions. So Popular culture inundates us with movies and music and literature which articulate a theory of mental illness and distress. So, you can think of many, many, many movies. And so you have a theory, you just are unfamiliar with it. You've just gathered it together from all that you've been exposed to, and so you have an unconscious and internal kind of theory about how people are mentally ill or distressed. So what we're going to do here is we're going to surface some of our unconscious theories, because we're going to wrestle with it as we wrestle with Cooper White, and then we're going to develop a theory of pastoral counseling. You need a good psychological theory that can give you the bones of understanding how a self may be constructed. You need a theological framework that enmeshes with a psychological theory so as to provide the framework for practical theological care. So, you have a special job because you are going to be working with people who are asking for help to work through psychological issues, but psychological issues that have a spiritual component to them. So, you need to have a thick theology and you need to have a thick psychological theory. So there's a great number of psychological theories and therapy methodologies in current use. There are some commonalities between them all, but some of them are quite different. I remember Reverend Dr. Jody Clark would always say, "Look, you got to have a theory. You can't just randomly counsel people. You have to have a theory." There's lots of theories out there, but he kind of felt that if you believed in a certain psychological theory and kept learning within that framework, constant continual learning, that was good, because you are working within a framework with congregants and clients that is not about you, and that whatever your hunch is. So it's just important to have a map and a framework. So Cooper White lays out a history of psychological theories of the self, and then she pushes them further so that they marry a Trinitarian theological construct that makes a powerful case for coming to appreciate and connect with our own internal multiple selves. So that's her thing, that she takes all the established theory, the one after another, takes the pieces of them that have stood the test of time, and then she works with them to marry them to a Trinitarian concept of God that is also multiple. And so it's a very rich and very important way of thinking about psychology and God. So the premise of her book is that both persons and God are multiple. The pastoral formulation of the Trinity is, in her version of it, creative profusion, incarnational desire, and living inspiration. And it's a lot to take in, her theories, but bear with her because it's worth it. As I said, other students have said that they struggled with it, but as time went on and they worked in pastoral care and they did a further study, they really valued it. So stick with it. So there are four major psychoanalytic theories that Cooper White works with. And she says the four basic models that exist in psychoanalytic world don't replace each other, but all are needed to fully understand the mind. And so these are the Kohut's vertical split, Klein's internal splitting, object relations, and dissociative fragmentation. And she then works out her own model, which incorporates a theological premise that God as Trinity is multiple. Psychoanalysis. So where did it all begin? Well, Sigmund Freud, you've heard about him. He was the groundbreaker in terms of understanding mental illness or neuroses as a dis-ease of the mind. And he founded psychoanalysis. And this was kind of a radical idea, as mental illness was previously thought of as a result of kind of a combination of sin and genetics and being of an unfortunate political class. So there is a lot of class hygiene in theory in the Victorian era. So Freud saw the self as being constructed like an iceberg with our conscious which are acceptable thoughts peeking out above a pre-conscious and subconscious thoughts, which in turn arose out of a large, dark mass of unconscious, unacceptable, forbidden thoughts. So therapy consisted of pulling up the unconscious so as to resolve conflicts that underlay mental illness. And this, I am greatly simplifying a very complex theory because you could take whole courses on this. One of the very useful things that Freud came up with that we still use and is the concept of transference and countertransference in the relationship between the counselor and the counselee. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but that was an extremely valuable concept that is really helpful for the therapy. We'll get into them later because identifying transference and counter-transference is critical for clergy. When clergy run into trouble with inappropriate behavior, it is because they have misunderstood transference and counter-transference. Cooper White does a good job of describing Freud's theories and Freud's problems. I'm not a Freud fan. Freud is very phallic-centered. The therapist is a hero. The treatment of women who were frequently diagnosed with hysteria and therefore considered repressed and sexually voracious, whose transference excused all kinds of bad behavior by male therapists seeking to liberate them, kind of ruins Freud for me. So, like there were a number of psychiatrists sleeping with their patients in those days, and she writes about the unfortunate case of Dora, who was a teenage girl who had been sexually abused, and just the way she was dealt with in therapy was it just makes you want to cry. What makes me want to think about cry about it that is just her situation is just multiplied by thousands of 10,000s of young women who were treated that way. So I'll leave you to read that in her book, but she does a pretty good job of explaining it. So Carl Jung was a student to Freud, and he introduced spirituality into psychoanalysis. He created a complicated structure of the self that eventually so conflicted with Freud's that they became estranged. So Jung's work paved the way for a psychoanalytic structure that incorporated narrative, myth, and spiritual tropes. And that was very valuable for psychoanalysis and very valuable for the kind of work that we do, in the sense that it's valuable that people recognize that spirituality is an important part of recovery. And then there are the relational theories. So you have Freud and Jung and all those guys, and then along come the relational theories, the theorists. So Piaget, Erik Erikson, Anna Freud. And these theories focus on kind of a linear development of an individual towards selfhood. So, there's kind of stages. Fowler, who came up with stages of faith, was kind of this mind too. So this idea that there are stages you go through, tickety boo, but when things go off, when you miss a stage or you can't fulfill a stage or you get stopped at a stage, everything falls apart. And so these are set up like what we call a boxcar model, which is to say that boxcars are added to the train of the self as a child and youth matures, but then something goes wrong with one boxcar, the whole train is derailed. So, these theories are very much like the hero's journey, which was the favored motif of white European males. And these theories were challenged because of the linearity of the models, the idea of progressing through stages, the prescriptive quality of the stages, that you can't move on until you move through this stage, the idealization of individualism, and the idealization of health as being a state of staged success. That success is what you're about if you're to be mentally healthy, and it's going through these stages that you gain. Now, again, I'm simplifying it because we don't have all the time in the world. So, the important contribution of relational theories is that a recognition came that babies and children do go through important stages of development that have an impact on mental health all of their lives. So, that was something people hadn't thought of before, that, oh, wow, like, like that that babies and children have these, developmental stages, and that they build upon each other. And it also, the relational theories also, the importance of nurture on the neurological hardwiring of all of us, became important. And that, that is true too. I mean, that has been borne out again and again. So babies are hardwired to connect, explore, and move. And if everything's pretty good at home, if they get just basic parenting, there's nothing more curious than a baby or a child. 80% of a person's neural pathways are built before the age of 5. So it's important before the age of that piece from 1 to 5 is really important. Babies and toddlers and young children have an explosion in neurological growth, and more importantly, the preening of neurons. So the brain is amazingly good at getting rid of stuff. So, it's always purging. So if this is why, if you have a strabismus like my son did, you have to catch them early, because if the brain isn't getting signals from one of the eyes, or signals that don't make sense, it just cuts that part off. I don't need that part. I'll fill that with other neurons, right? So, you end up not being able to see. The Another implication of this is COVID. So I have grandchildren, and who my youngest grandchild was a baby during COVID, and my daughter-in-law noticed that she was delayed with her language, and she took her to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Look, all these kids are delayed. They will be a cohort when they hit kindergarten that are going to have some deficits, and part of it is because when you're in lockdown in an apartment with only your family, you miss a lot of learning, because just think, even what it takes to take a baby to the park, you meet your neighbors, you see trees, you see lots of unidentified things that are not in your apartment. So you learn a lot of words, and you hear a lot of words, and you hear a lot of people speaking. Built on that is they don't see people's mouths move, because everybody has a mask on, right, when they're outside their home. So these early years are really important. Now, 18 to 24 months, babies develop what I call the bones of affective competency. So they can go from "I am crying" to "I am crying because I'm sad" to "Mom, I am crying because I am sad. You won't give me that popsicle." So there's that stage where they're just sad and crying, to some recognition that, "Oh, I'm crying because I'm sad," to, "Oh, I'm sad because I didn't get this and I wanted it, and my mom's not listening to me." So, those are pretty early stage that persons manage to learn their affective competency. Babies and toddlers develop empathy and a sense of morality really early. Even under 1 year old, they have an innate sense of fairness, and they can empathize with each other. They go to, "I wonder why my sister is sad. Maybe they want a popsicle too." So, there's that's the fourth stage, right? Developing empathy. So you go from "I'm sad" to, or "I'm crying," sorry, "I'm crying," to "I'm crying because I'm sad," to "I'm crying because I'm sad that my mother won't give me a popsicle," to "Oh, look, my sister's crying. Maybe she needs a popsicle too." So, there's a lot that happens in those early years. Now, if you want to learn about babies, there's Nature of Things had a show on called Born to Be Good, Babies Born to Be Good, and about all the latest research on the ethics, on how babies develop morality super early, like you wouldn't believe it. It was just a remarkable show. So, what is relevant about what is important about this in terms of psychoanalysis and self is that Cooper White says early childhood is the time in which shame can create deficits. So, shame is the difference between "I have done a bad thing," I've taken a popsicle and I shouldn't have, to I am a bad thing. I'm a terrible human being because I took a popsicle. So, it's parental responses that determine this, right? So Cooper White says, these are really important years. So the emotion surrounding early childhood impacts neurological development itself. So Cooper White says all the emotions that happen in those early years determine the structure of your brain in terms of its actual physical neurological framework. The process of neurological development and affective competence is never finished. We never stop learning about our emotions and our feelings, but continues to increase in depth and complexity over the lifespan. So let's think about counseling for a bit. So, Cooper White and every single CPE unit you will ever take, and I recommend taking one, is that knowledge of one's own wounds is a prerequisite so as to avoid the pitfalls of bias and projection. So we're going to talk about projection later too, because it's a really important concept. So you need to know yourself. You want to be useful to people, then you need to know yourself. And that's a lifelong process. So a pastor's caring task involves she says, putting their emotional and developmental needs above our own during the time we spend with them. So putting the client or the congregant's emotional and developmental needs above our own during the time we spend with them. So, we can care for ourselves afterwards. But the reason we need to know ourselves is because we need to put ourselves aside to a certain extent, draw upon our wisdom and our knowledge, but we need to be for the patient. We need to make space for the congregant. We need to put ourselves not in the way of the congregant. So, object relations. Donald Winnicott and Melanie Klein are the great thinkers in this area. And they have some interesting early theories about how babies begin to develop their sense of self, and it is built around internal objects. So that their theory is that babies create internal representations of people and things that are important to them, and that they become part of themselves. So they say the first object is the breast. Now, they had some really, I think, strange things to say about the breast, and you can read that in Cooper White too. Now, the thing to remember about this is that objects have a life of their own. So remember, they are representations of an other that is in relationship with them. So an object doesn't bear the exact characteristics of that other. And we all do this. My spouse is an object who exists internally in me in all kinds of representations. Many of these, I discover over 40 years, are not completely accurate. So, we're always working through our internal representation, our objects that are within ourselves. So, Winnicott and Klein had articulated a theory that is really helpful and, it has been really critical in terms of psychoanalytic theory. Mirroring. So, mirroring and idealization of the caregiver. So, mirroring is the caregiver needs to see the child and mirror back what they see. And the child then knows that they are seen and therefore exist and are worth loving. And a caregiver needs to fall in love with the child. So, when your child is born and they put them in your arms, they're designed to elicit love and positive regard to come from you. And they need to see that. So, they need to have somebody looking at them thinking, oh, you're just so beautiful, you're so wonderful, and responding to their needs, right? When they cry, they're picked up. When they're hungry, they're fed. So the child knows they are seen, their needs are seen. So that's mirroring. So, and when they are mirrored by a caregiver, they know they exist and are worth loving. So, and that's really important because when we talk about some of the things that go wrong with mirroring, narcissism is one of them. And narcissism means that nobody mirrored that child. So the other concept is idealization of the caregiver. The child needs for their own internal objectification to see the caregiver in idealized terms. If the caregiver is abusive, this causes extreme damage. So, kids get to be, about 9 or 10 and they just think you're amazing. And then, they get to be preteen and teenagers and they kind of figure out that you really aren't that amazing. So, that idealization of the caregiver is important. But if the caregiver is abusive to the child, then the idealization, it can't happen. It's broken, right? If there is an uninterested caregiver or no caregiver, there could be no mirroring and a problem with attachment, and the person feels totally empty. So, narcissistic personality disorder is kind of a state of permanent emptiness. So, I read an interview with Mary Trump who said of her brother, she's a psychologist. She said about or her uncle, sorry, Donald Trump. She said of him, she said, she felt he was empty inside, and she said there is no there, right? And psychologists and psychiatrists describe narcissists of having an internal feeling that it's called a feeling of constant falling with no arms to catch them. So abuse interferes with both mirroring and idealization of the caregiver. Now, you're probably sitting there like I always am when I'm reading this stuff, thinking, oh, did I do a good job? Did I do everything right? But Winnicott also was very helpful in coining the phrase good enough parent. So, he says you don't actually need a lot to raise a healthy human being in terms of their self-worth. You don't have to be a super parent, and you can make mistakes. But over the long run, you need to be consistently loving and taking time to see the child and be worthy of their trust. So, children, as I said, have a fairly good sense of inner justice. So, when you're yelling at them for something that they did, and but you mostly have a consistent track record of loving them and treating them decently, they can say, man, I don't deserve this, right? So, if you've done a good job, they do talk back to you. Objects have a life of their own and can be projected onto the screen of other people. So that's called projective identification. Cooper White says projections may be experienced by the other as actually entering inside them and actually changing their behavior in relation to the person doing the projecting. This has implications for counseling. Projections occur when congregants see, almost always unconsciously, mom when they look at their pastor. Since women are usually most babies' primary and most important early caregiver, female ministers tend to be on the receiving end of very emotional projections. So, like I sometimes have male colleagues and they say, oh, I don't understand, like, why congregants are like so emotional with female ministers and why all this stuff happens. And it's like, well, that's mom energy, right? Like if you had an issue with your mom and your minister's a woman, that's you're going to be projecting it onto that woman. So within their theories, they also helped coin a concept, self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is when a person has experienced negative experiences from a negative caregiver and projects those onto other relationships. And it's why people tend to end up in serial abusive relationships. This can be broken by a new object that neither abandons the person or retaliates when the person behaves badly. So that is also something that can happen in long-term therapy, is that when a good therapist can be that new object that neither abandons the person nor retaliates when the person behaves badly. And you can see the self-fulfilling prophecy in people who have been abused. Perhaps they had I remember when I did a volunteer my final year at AST, and we were placed in volunteer placements, and I was in Adsum House, which is a shelter for women and children. And it was interesting to me that I learned one of the things I learned there was that if a woman has had an abusive father and has had abusive male relationships, there can be this idea within the woman's mind that a person isn't really a man unless they're tough and abusive. So, it's self-fulfilling prophecy. Why can't I find somebody who treats me well? But if a woman sees a man caring for them and being kind to them as being soft and not being manly, well, that sets up a serial dynamic. So now, in terms of self-fulfilling prophecy and projection, I always like Reverend Dr. Jody Clark's famous question when somebody's mad at him, or when he's doing a CP unit, who am I for you? Like when somebody's mad at you. It's a really good question for you to think about, right? When one of your congregants is really angry with you, and it's like totally out of order and you can't figure it out. It's really good to ask the question, who am I for you, I wonder? Because there's somebody back there in their history. So implications for spirituality. Well, Cooper White says internalized representations of primary caregivers early in life are not only projected onto other people, they also constitute the core of a person's internal representation of God. So, like if you have objects within you, representations of primary caretakers, if you've had a very angry father, you know, you probably have a good idea that God is very angry too. So, like we cannot divorce our upbringing and our internal representations of how the world works from our ideas about who God actually is. So, good pastoral care and counseling can facilitate the emergence of broader, more open, more healing, and life-giving images of God. So, that's part of your work, and that's why it's important to develop a thick theology and to learn how to ask really good questions, because broadening out that understanding of God is really helpful. And you've probably already had experiences where, something happens, a car accident happens to somebody, and they'll say, why is God punishing me that way? Well, the question is, why does your God punish anybody, right? Like, why do you have a punishing God? So, who in your background was punishing? So, those are really important questions. And God as exclusively male has been damaging for Western societies and the earth. And so Elizabeth Johnson and Sally McFaig have invited us to open up our metaphors. This idea of the white male God who's angry all the time has not been very helpful. So Bowen's family systems theory. So you will find that Bowen is often quoted a lot in consultants who do church dynamic work. So Bowen built on a combination of all of these and added the idea that the effects of intergenerational forces in a family system affects groups and people. So most church development specialists rely, as I said, heavily on Bowen family systems theory. And when you think about families, like families just don't appear out of nowhere. They develop over stages and over ages with implications for subsequent generations. And if you've done a genealogram with people who are getting married, I used to do that with marriage classes, and it was really helpful because you would see certain patterns emerging through many generations that you could talk about. I had one couple where the woman, she went 4 generations back, and every single person in her family, uncles, great uncles, all were divorced. And she looked at me and she said, That's not good, is it? And I said, well, maybe you'll be the first. So let's work on that. They did end up getting divorced actually within 2 years of marrying. So, family systems, if you've never had she's never had a model, even with an extended family, of how to work through marital issues, then you don't know how to do that. Somebody has to teach you. Bereaved families. I want to talk a little bit about that. Well, first, let's talk about groups and organizations. So, your congregation often functions as a family system, or if you have a large congregation, there will be groups of family systems. These people need not be related to each other, they just function as a family system. And when you have a system like that, each person introduces into a system residual objects from their original families. So, when you have 20 people in a room, you're dealing with 20 people's families. So, it's just always good to remember that. People just don't come out of nowhere fully constructed. Bereaved families. So siblings, what I've learned about bereaved families, this is really helpful when you're working with bereaved families, because what I've discovered, well, and most people, you'll know this over the years, is that siblings can usually sort things out when somebody has died. Or even talking about wills, the problems come when you have the spouses of siblings come into the room and begin to want to help things be sorted out. So, introducing the in-laws, very little positive can happen because confusion ensues. So why do you think that might be? It's because each in-law has come from a different family. So they introduce into that room their own family systems. And another way of talking about this is everyone adds their own internal objects to a highly emotional room. A lot of projection, a lot of things. So, if you have 3 or 4 siblings trying to sort out funerals or dying arrangements or after death care, and then they bring their spouses in, you're actually dealing with 6 families in. So, it becomes very difficult. So I always encourage, and I usually say that to people. I usually say, you know what? If you probably just meet as siblings, you could probably sort through these things. And I'm honest with them. I said, as soon as you bring in-laws in, it's a lot of different perspectives. I don't say they bring their internal objects in. I say it's a lot of perspectives and different family cultures. So, it's probably best that you work that out on your own. And, and they immediately, almost immediately, because they all think, oh, I have an in-law who's kind of crazy, they see that that's a good idea. So, now if there's a family in which there's abuse, extreme abuse, obviously there's gonna, something different needs to happen. But, we're not, I'm not talking about that kind of a situation. So there are other modalities of therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a very famous one these days. And I also would like to talk a little bit about gender identities. So, we are at a time where we're beginning to recognize, thankfully, that gender is a construct. And so, there are lots of different variations in how people understand themselves in terms of gender. So that enters into a therapeutic relationship. And a person also exists in the wider culture, context of culture and subcultures. So, and what Cooper White says about culture, she said, no one escapes the force of culture. However, ultimately, culture is the medium for all development and for reality itself. So, and that's true today more than ever. I mean, the whole era of just sorting out fake news, et cetera, that there are world constructs that we find ourselves rubbing up against. And, a reality that people say exists that we don't believe, right? So, culture gets to name reality, and culture, begins with Adam and Eve. So this is biblical. So, as soon as the story goes, as soon as Adam and Eve come into the world, they have the task of naming things. And when you name things, you create culture. So, and within culture, we can choose, like Adam and Eve, stewardship or domination. So Cooper White says naming is important. So what is left unnamed is not given the status of reality. So, our job is to help people have a space to be able to name things. But she's also talking globally and wide, culture wise, that language and violence combine to create a reality that defines each individual identity and names for his or her place within the hierarchical structures of power. So we live in that, we swim in that, that comes into the room when we are working with congregants. Cross-cultural communication requires empathy, and empathy requires risk of exposure, harm, or criticism, and empathy is harmed in childhood trauma. So we'll come back full circle and say that good early mirroring, if you remember what mirroring is, allows mentoring and empathy. So learning to accept others in the culture that are not the same as us depends on empathy that is developed in early childhood. So next time we will talk about splitting, dissociation, and the multiple selves and how healing happens and continues to happen for all of us.